Hi there. I would like to take us again back to the 1960s, a time in America of enormous social change. Big, of course, was the whole racial issue between whites and blacks. And thankfully, we had the leadership of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to kind of guide us through this sticky problem. It was time to stop treating the blacks so condescendingly. The English and the French, and meanwhile, also realizing it was time to step out of their position in Africa for much the same reason. Portuguese were still trying to hang on to their colony, but not succeeding. But most interesting of all was this question of South Africa. It was a much more complex situation because there was a huge white community living there and had for centuries. And there was little likelihood that they were going to follow the trend of just simply, quote unquote, going home. This was their home. They weren't going somewhere else. Understanding my interest in this, my mentor at Georgetown, Dr. Victor Firkus, said, why don't I look into this for my master's thesis, which I gladly did, thinking perhaps maybe I'm looking at a revolution, a social revolution of some kind in the making. Well, anyway, it didn't take me long to realize, not quite as anyone might expect, because South Africa is multiracial and not just black and white as Americans tend to see these matters. For instance, the blacks themselves are deeply divided, tribally speaking, especially the Bantu blacks, the warrior, between the Xhosa, who kind of want to dominate, and the Zulu, who used to dominate, and they fought each other bitterly. Then also, the white community was not a single group. It was two very different groups. One Dutch-speaking, the original inhabitants who came there in the 1600s and who still spoke a dialect of Dutch called Afrikaans, because they call themselves Afrikaners or Africans, and the English who came only in the 1800s for economic reasons, because they wanted to exploit its wealth. In fact, the two had a horrible Boer War at the very beginning of the 20th century. Then there were the descendants of the original inhabitants, the San people, the Bushmen and Hottentots, who had found refuge among the Afrikaners because the Bantu sweeping into the area slaughtered them like animals. Interestingly, therefore, the coloreds, as they call themselves today, speak Dutch, Afrikaans. Then there is the huge community Americans know almost nothing about, living in Natal, the Indian community brought in by the British from India to work the sugar plantations there. It should be a significant community to our understanding in the complexity of things, because Gandhi himself was a lawyer there for over 20 years. Gandhi, can you imagine him dressed up like a proper British lawyer, British trained back in London? I mean, we think of him as some kind of a Hindu guru dressed in a loincloth. Well, that was after 20 years of not finding his effort to bring India to greatness in South Africa. He got tired and headed off to India to fight the English there during World War I. What I realized at the end of all this research was I can't see the Afrikaners, who were doing their best with their so-called apartheid or separateness strategy, which we just hated because it was so racially discriminatory. From their point of view, it was a matter of protecting their borders from the massive number of Bantu blacks migrating in from the tribal areas, because there's no economy in the tribal areas, and so they wanted to flood into the Afrikaner areas. The Afrikaners were not going to just simply give up. Therefore, after presenting a 250-page master's thesis, I concluded that nothing was going to change, at least not for another generation. Sure, the tensions were there, but those tensions could be found widely across the world in other places. Some of the other professors thought I was a bit insensitive in my conclusion, but Dr. Firkus liked the fact that this was just a realistic appraisal. I wasn't taking sides in this. I was just trying to understand the dynamics of a multiracial society. And he appreciated my effort so much that, in fact, he asked me to stay on at Georgetown and continue my studies towards a doctorate there, which I agreed. And I would, by the way, never lose interest in South Africa. And by the way, I will eventually return to the issue 20 years later, but that's another posting. But I did want to see how my predictions were in fact working out. So stay tuned. There's more on the subject. Have a great day. Bye.